Hansel and Gretel isn't a fairy tale. It's a confession written in children's blood by mothers who ate their own babies to survive. What millions read as bedtime stories are actually survival manuals teaching kids how to escape when their own parents start sharpening knives and calculating which child has the most meat on their bones. This isn't fiction. This was medieval Germany, where Hansel and Gretel was born from actual events too horrific for modern minds to comprehend. Every horrifying detail in this fairy tale actually happened. We'll witness mothers carving their babies into dinner portions while the children beg for mercy. We'll walk through flesh markets where 7-year-olds burn alive, screaming for parents who sold them to witch hunters. We'll follow trails of blood through frozen forests where parents feed their own children to wolves rather than watch them starve. We'll taste the sweet crack of sisters' bones between brothers' teeth as families consume each other to survive. And we'll uncover the truth about a mother who died screaming her children's names as her community decided she had become too dangerous to live. The fairy tale ends happily ever after. The real story ends with something that will haunt your nightmares forever. Are you ready to discover what really happened when the fairy tale ended? Chapter 1. When mothers carved their babies for dinner. The year 1315 marked the beginning of hell on earth. Not metaphorically, but literally, as Europe descended into a cannibalistic nightmare that would define an entire generation. This wasn't just hunger, this was the complete collapse of civilization, where parents looked at their children and saw their next meal. For decades leading up to 1315, Europe had experienced unprecedented agricultural success. New farming techniques spread across the continent, crops flourished, and food became more abundant than ever before. This abundance triggered a population explosion that seemed like a blessing. Families grew larger, towns expanded, and everyone believed the good times would last forever. They were catastrophically wrong. The medieval warm period that had blessed Europe with mild temperatures and perfect growing conditions came to an abrupt end. What followed was a mini-ice age that turned fertile farmland into frozen wasteland virtually overnight. But it wasn't just the cold that killed, it was the rain. Torrential downpours that lasted for months destroyed crops across the continent. Fields that had fed thousands became muddy graveyards of rotting vegetation. The price of basic staples like wheat, oats, and salt didn't just increase. They exploded beyond comprehension. A single loaf of bread cost more than most families earned in a month. Salt, essential for preserving what little food remained, became more valuable than gold. Even those who could afford these prices found the shelves empty, because there simply wasn't enough food to buy. As winter set in, the true horror began. Families who had lived comfortably for generations found themselves making impossible choices. Children who had never known hunger suddenly felt their stomachs eating themselves from the inside. Parents watched helplessly as their babies wasted away, their cries growing weaker each day until they fell silent forever. The first reports of cannibalism emerged from the most desperate regions. Families who had exhausted every other option turned to the unthinkable. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals disturbing patterns in burial sites, with human remains showing clear signs of butchering and consumption. The bones tell a story too horrific for most historians to discuss openly. What made this cannibalism even more disturbing was how organized it became. This wasn't random acts of desperation, but calculated decisions about which family members would be sacrificed first. The elderly were often the first to go, followed by the youngest children who consumed resources but couldn't contribute to survival efforts. Some families even developed twisted rituals around these decisions, creating ceremonies to justify their actions. The psychological impact was devastating. Survivors from this period, those few whose accounts were preserved, described a complete breakdown of human bonds. Parents who had loved their children more than life itself found themselves calculating the caloric value of their tiny bodies. Children learned to sleep with one eye open, knowing their own parents might decide they were expendable. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Great Famine was how it normalized the unthinkable. Child abandonment, which had been rare and shameful, became so common it was barely remarked upon. Cannibalism, once considered the ultimate taboo, became an open secret that entire communities participated in. The social fabric that held civilization together simply disintegrated. This is the world that created Hansel and Gretel. When the brothers Grimm collected this tale centuries later, they weren't recording a fantasy about a gingerbread house. They were preserving the memory of a time when parents regularly abandoned their children to die, when starvation drove families to consume their own flesh and blood, when survival meant abandoning every principle of human decency. The mother in Hansel and Gretel who insists on abandoning her children wasn't a villain created by storytellers. She was every mother who faced the impossible choice between watching her entire family starve slowly or giving some of them a chance at survival. The witch who fattens children before eating them wasn't a monster from imagination. She was the logical endpoint of a society that had learned to see children as food sources rather than human beings. Chapter 2. The Flesh Markets Where Children Burned Alive. If the Great Famine turned Europe into a cannibalistic wasteland, the witch hunts that followed transformed it into something even worse, a continent-wide torture chamber where accusation meant death and paranoia consumed entire communities. Germany became the epicenter of this madness, where the smell of burning flesh filled the air daily and rivers ran red with the blood of the innocent. The witch hunts didn't emerge from nowhere. They were the direct result of a traumatized population desperately seeking someone to blame for the horrors they had endured. After the Great Famine killed millions and destroyed the social order, survivors needed a scapegoat. The Catholic Church, eager to consolidate power and deflect criticism from their own failures during the crisis, provided the perfect target: witches. What began as isolated accusations quickly metastasized into mass hysteria. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, a manual for identifying and prosecuting witches, gave legal legitimacy to the most depraved forms of torture and murder. This book didn't just describe how to identify witches. It provided detailed instructions for extracting confessions through methods so brutal they would make medieval executioners blush. The accusations followed predictable patterns that revealed the true nature of this persecution. Old women, especially those who were single or widowed, became primary targets. Their crime wasn't practicing witchcraft. It was being vulnerable in a society that had lost its capacity for mercy. Women who owned property, who displayed any independence, who failed to conform to strict social expectations, all found themselves facing charges that carried an automatic death sentence. The legal system that prosecuted these cases was designed to ensure conviction. Once accused of witchcraft, the victim was immediately imprisoned and tortured. The torture wasn't designed to punish. It was designed to extract confessions. Women were stretched on racks until their joints separated, had their fingernails torn off with red-hot pincers, were subjected to the strappado, where their arms were tied behind their backs, and they were hoisted off the ground until their shoulders dislocated. But the physical torture was only part of the horror. Victims were forced to confess not just to their own supposed crimes, but to name accomplices. This created a snowball effect where each confession led to dozens of new arrests. Entire families were wiped out as accusations spread through communities like plague. Children as young as 7 years old were burned at the stake after confessing, under torture, to having intercourse with the devil. The scale of the slaughter was unprecedented. In southwestern Germany alone, courts executed over 3,000 people in systematic campaigns that resembled genocide more than justice. Entire villages were depopulated as the witch-hunting frenzy consumed everyone in its path. The town of Würzburg saw its population cut in half as accusers targeted entire families, social groups, and professional guilds. One of the most horrifying aspects of these hunts was how they turned communities against themselves. Neighbors who had lived peacefully for generations suddenly viewed each other with deadly suspicion. Any misfortune, from crop failure to illness to accident, could be blamed on witchcraft. The social bonds that had held communities together for centuries were severed as paranoia replaced trust. The trials themselves were grotesque theater designed to justify predetermined conclusions. Evidence included spectral testimony, where accusers claimed to see the spirits of the accused tormenting them. Physical examinations searched for devil's marks, which could be any mole, scar, or birthmark. Even the inability to cry under torture was considered proof of guilt, as witches were supposedly incapable of producing tears. Children weren't spared from this madness. Over 50 children under the age of 12 were executed for witchcraft in Germany during this period. Their confessions, extracted through torture, describe impossible acts of devil worship and cannibalism. These children died screaming, burned alive while crowds cheered, their only crime being born into a society that had lost its sanity. The witch hunts created a culture of violence that permeated every aspect of German society. Public executions became entertainment, with entire families bringing picnic lunches to watch their neighbors burn. The smell of charred flesh became so common that people stopped noticing it. Death became so routine that the living stopped grieving for the dead. This is the atmosphere that shaped Hansel and Gretel. The witch in the story wasn't a fantasy creature. She was the embodiment of every old woman who had been accused, tortured, and murdered by her own community. Her cannibalistic desires reflected the real fears that consumed medieval Germans, the terror that their neighbors might literally consume them. Her death by fire wasn't poetic justice. It was the standard method of execution that thousands of innocent people had suffered. The story's message wasn't about good triumphing over evil. It was about a society so broken by trauma and paranoia that it had learned to solve its problems through violence and murder. Gretel pushing the witch into the oven wasn't heroism. It was the logical conclusion of a culture that had been trained to see killing as the solution to every problem. Chapter 3. Feeding wolves your own blood. In the frozen forests of medieval Germany, tiny footprints led nowhere, ending abruptly where small bodies had fallen and been consumed by wolves or worse. This wasn't the isolated tragedy of a few desperate families. This was systematic child disposal on a scale that defies comprehension. An entire generation of children was deemed expendable, their lives worth less than the food they consumed. Child abandonment during the Great Famine wasn't the desperate last resort of loving parents. It was calculated population control implemented by communities that had learned to view children as economic burdens rather than human beings. The decision wasn't made in moments of desperation. It was planned during family meetings where parents discussed which children had the best chance of survival and which could be most easily sacrificed. The methods of abandonment were designed to provide psychological cover for parents while ensuring the children would die. Taking children deep into forests wasn't about giving them a chance at survival. It was about making sure they would never find their way back home to burden their families again. The distances involved were carefully calculated to exceed what small children could walk, especially when weakened by starvation. Parents developed elaborate rituals around these abandonments to justify their actions. They would tell children they were going on adventures or special trips. Some families created false stories about temporary separations, promising to return for the children after finding food or work. These lies weren't meant to comfort the children. They were meant to allow parents to sleep at night after condemning their offspring to death. The abandoned children faced horrors beyond imagination. Those who survived the first night in the wilderness often lasted only days before succumbing to exposure, starvation, or predation. Archaeological evidence from this period shows mass graves containing the remains of children who clearly died from exposure and malnutrition. Their bones tell stories of prolonged suffering that ended in lonely, terrifying deaths. But some children didn't die immediately, and their fate was often worse than quick death. Bands of abandoned children formed feral groups that survived by eating bark, insects, and when those ran out, each other. Reports from this period describe gangs of child cannibals who attacked travelers and raided villages. These weren't monsters. They were babies who had been forced to become predators to survive. The psychological impact on surviving children was devastating. Those few who managed to return home found families who viewed them as unwanted ghosts from a past they wanted to forget. Many parents refused to acknowledge these returned children, claiming they were imposters or demons sent to torment them. The trauma of abandonment was compounded by the trauma of rejection upon return. Communities developed informal systems for managing child abandonment that reveal the systematic nature of this practice. Certain forests became known dumping grounds where families would take unwanted children. Villages created informal schedules to avoid overcrowding these areas. Some communities even established rules about which types of children could be abandoned and when. The selection process for which children to abandon followed brutal logic that prioritized immediate survival over human bonds. Disabled children were always the first to go, followed by the youngest who consumed resources without contributing labor. Girls were often chosen over boys in communities that valued male labor. Children who showed signs of illness were abandoned immediately to prevent them from consuming food that could keep healthy children alive. Parents developed psychological mechanisms to cope with these decisions that reveal the depth of their moral collapse. They convinced themselves that abandoned children will be better off dead than slowly starving at home. They created elaborate fantasies about kind strangers who would rescue their children and provide better lives. They told themselves that abandonment was actually mercy. The church, which should have provided moral guidance during this crisis, instead legitimized child abandonment by reframing it as God's will. Priests taught that families were being tested by divine providence and that sacrificing children demonstrated faith in God's plan. This religious justification allowed communities to abandon children without feeling they had violated Christian principles. Some families attempted to game the system by abandoning children temporarily and returning for them if conditions improved. But these children, traumatized by initial abandonment, often refused to return home or had been so changed by their experiences that their families couldn't accept them back. The psychological bonds between parents and children were severed permanently, creating generations of people incapable of forming normal family relationships. The story of Hansel and Gretel captures all these horrific realities. The mother's insistence on abandonment wasn't individual cruelty. It was community wisdom passed down from families who had learned that child sacrifice was necessary for survival. The children's initial return home wasn't heartwarming. It was the temporary reprieve that many abandoned children experienced before being discarded permanently. The breadcrumb trail that gets eaten by birds wasn't poetic metaphor. It was the reality that abandoned children faced when they tried to return home. The paths back to safety were always destroyed by forces beyond their control, leaving them trapped in wilderness that would consume them just as surely as any witch's oven. Chapter 4. The Sweet Taste of Your Sister's Bones. The human teeth marks on children's bones found in medieval German burial sites tell a story so horrific that most archaeologists refuse to discuss their findings publicly. These aren't random acts of violence or ritual sacrifice. They're evidence of systematic cannibalism practiced by ordinary families who had crossed the final line of human civilization. This was the world where eating your own children became not just possible, but necessary. The transition to cannibalism didn't happen overnight. It followed a predictable pattern that began with eating pets and livestock, progressed to consuming leather goods and tree bark, and finally ended with families viewing their weakest members as potential food sources. Each step in this descent seemed reasonable when the alternative was watching everyone die slowly from starvation. Archaeological evidence reveals that cannibalism during this period wasn't random or chaotic. Families developed systematic approaches to human consumption that suggest careful planning and organization. Bone-cut marks follow patterns consistent with butchering techniques used on animals. Skeletal remains show evidence of cooking methods designed to maximize nutritional value from human flesh. The selection process for which family members would be consumed followed brutal but logical criteria. The elderly were often chosen first, as they contributed least to family survival while consuming precious resources. Young children came next, particularly those too young to work but old enough to provide substantial nutrition. The strongest adults were preserved as long as possible to maintain the family's ability to find food. Families developed elaborate justification systems to make cannibalism psychologically bearable. They convinced themselves that consuming deceased family members honored their memory by allowing their sacrifice to sustain the living. Some created religious ceremonies around human consumption, reframing cannibalism as Holy Communion. Others treated it as medical necessity, like amputating infected limbs to save the whole body. The preparation and consumption of human flesh became ritualized in ways that reveal how completely normal this practice became. Families developed specific techniques for butchering human bodies that maximized usable meat while minimizing psychological trauma. Children were taught to assist with these processes as naturally as they had once learned to help prepare animal meals. But not all cannibalism involved family members who had died naturally. As the famine continued and natural deaths became insufficient to sustain survivors, some families began making active decisions about which members should be killed for food. These weren't sudden, violent acts, but carefully planned family meetings where the weakest members were selected for sacrifice. The psychological mechanisms families used to cope with murdering relatives for food reveal the complete breakdown of normal human bonds. Parents convinced themselves they were showing mercy by quickly ending their children's suffering rather than watching them starve slowly. Children learned to accept their potential selection for consumption as natural family duty. Some families attempted to maintain moral boundaries by only consuming strangers or members of other families. This led to the development of informal networks where families would trade deceased members to avoid the psychological trauma of eating their own relatives. These trading systems became so organized they resembled primitive markets with established exchange rates. The impact on children who survived this period was catastrophic. Those who witnessed their siblings being butchered and consumed developed psychological trauma that lasted generations. Many became incapable of forming normal family bonds, viewing relatives as potential threats rather than sources of love and protection. The basic trust that should exist between family members was permanently severed. Communities developed social rules around cannibalism that attempted to maintain some semblance of civilization while acknowledging its necessity. Certain types of human consumption were considered more acceptable than others. Eating strangers was preferable to eating family members. Consuming those who had died naturally was better than murdering for food. These distinctions seem meaningless now, but they provided crucial psychological structure for people trying to maintain their humanity. The witch in Hansel and Gretel, who fattened children before eating them, wasn't a fantasy monster. She was the logical endpoint of a society that had learned to view children as livestock. Her systematic approach to human consumption, building traps to capture victims and carefully preparing them for meals, reflects the organized cannibalism that had become commonplace in medieval Germany. The children's horror at discovering the witch's intentions wasn't moral outrage at an unthinkable crime. It was the specific terror of prey recognizing predator. They understood immediately what the witch planned because they lived in a world where such plans were routine. Their escape wasn't heroic defiance of evil. It was the desperate struggle of food trying not to be eaten. The story's treatment of cannibalism as something monstrous reveals how completely medieval society had forgotten its own recent past. By the time the brothers Grimm collected this tale, the memory of widespread cannibalism had been suppressed so thoroughly that it seemed like impossible fantasy. But the bones buried in German soil remember what the living chose to forget. Chapter 5. She Died Screaming Your Names. The most disturbing revelation about Hansel and Gretel isn't found in what the story tells us, but in what it carefully conceals. Hidden beneath layers of sanitized retellings lies a truth so horrifying that storytellers have spent centuries trying to bury it. The mother's mysterious death while the children were gone wasn't coincidence or divine justice. It was the inevitable conclusion of a story that began with child abandonment and ended with something far worse. The original versions of this tale contain subtle clues that reveal the mother's true fate. Her desperate insistence on abandoning the children wasn't maternal cruelty. It was the behavior of someone who knew her time was running out. Her fury when the children returned the first time wasn't disappointment at their survival. It was panic that her carefully laid plans had been disrupted. She wasn't trying to get rid of burdens. She was trying to eliminate witnesses. Analysis of medieval German folklore reveals a pattern that appears repeatedly in stories from this period. Mothers who abandon children often die under mysterious circumstances that coincide perfectly with the children's absence. These deaths aren't random plot devices. They're coded references to practices so horrific that storytellers could only hint at them through metaphor and misdirection. The mother's death timing reveals the true nature of her condition. She didn't die from illness or accident. She died from the same systematic consumption that had become commonplace during the Great Famine. But unlike other cannibalism victims, she wasn't chosen randomly or because she was weak. She was selected because she had become something far more dangerous than a burden. She had become a predator. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals disturbing patterns in family burial sites that suggest systematic disposal of family members who had crossed certain moral boundaries. These weren't honorable burials of beloved relatives. They were hasty disposals of people who had become too dangerous to let live. The mother's death fits this pattern perfectly. The father's relief at the children's return and his apparent ignorance of the mother's death suggest he wasn't present when she died. But his willingness to immediately accept her absence without question reveals that her death wasn't unexpected. He knew what she had become, and he knew what had to be done about it. His elation at the children's survival wasn't just paternal love. It was relief that he hadn't lost everything to his wife's transformation. The witch's behavior in the story mirrors the mother's actions so closely that some interpretations suggest they're the same person. But the reality is even more disturbing. The witch represents what the mother had already become before her death. Her systematic approach to luring and consuming children, her obsessive focus on fattening them for meals, her complete lack of maternal instinct, these weren't fantastical evil traits. They were the logical endpoint of maternal cannibalism. The mother's insistence on abandoning the children wasn't about reducing family burden. It was about removing competition for limited food sources while simultaneously creating opportunities for hunting. Parents who had crossed the line into cannibalism often viewed their own children not as family members to protect, but as potential prey to harvest. The abandonment was actually preparation for predation. The timing of the mother's repeated attempts to abandon the children reveals escalating desperation that suggests her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Each failed abandonment made her more frantic because her need for human flesh was becoming uncontrollable. She wasn't trying to save the family through sacrifice. She was trying to feed her addiction through systematic child hunting. The father's passive cooperation with the abandonment plans, despite his obvious love for the children, suggests he understood the true nature of the threat his wife represented. His reluctant agreement wasn't weak-willed compliance. It was the desperate action of someone trying to protect his children from a predator who happened to be their mother. He knew that leaving her alone with them was more dangerous than abandoning them in the forest. The children's ability to survive in the wilderness while their mother died at home reveals the inverted nature of safety in their world. The forest, traditionally seen as dangerous and threatening, was actually safer than their home because it didn't contain the person who had learned to see them as food. Their survival skills weren't miraculous. They were the natural development of prey animals learning to avoid predators. The mother's death during the children's absence wasn't coincidence. It was community action. Medieval German communities developed informal systems for dealing with family members who had become cannibalistic threats. These weren't legal proceedings or formal executions. They were quiet disappearances that removed dangerous individuals while maintaining community stability. The story's ending, with the father welcoming the children home and living happily with their stolen wealth, represents the restoration of normal family structure after the removal of the cannibalistic element. The riches they bring back aren't just material wealth. They're symbolic payment for surviving horrors that should have destroyed them. Their happy ending is only possible because the person who threatened them most is gone forever. This is why Hansel and Gretel has survived for over 700 years, while other fairy tales have been forgotten. It's not a story about children defeating evil. It's a story about families learning to identify and eliminate the cannibalistic predators in their own homes. It's a survival manual disguised as entertainment, teaching children how to recognize when their own parents have become threats and how to escape before it's too late. The true horror of Hansel and Gretel isn't that children were abandoned in forests or that witches tried to eat them. The true horror is that in medieval Germany, the most dangerous monsters weren't strangers lurking in dark woods. They were the mothers tucking children into bed while calculating how much meat their small bodies would provide. The witch wasn't the real villain of this story. She was just a shadow cast by a mother who had learned to see her own children as dinner.